I am honored to introduce Dr. Francis S. Collins to all of you. Dr. Collins is a physician and geneticist. His groundbreaking work has led to the discovery of the cause of cystic fibrosis, among other diseases. In 1993, he was appointed director of the International Human Genome Project, which successfully sequenced all 3 billion letters of our DNA. He went on to serve 3 presidents as the director of the National Institutes of Health. Tonight, he will be talking about his new book, The Road to Wisdom, on truth, science, faith, and trust. Drawing from his experience leading the Human Genome Project and the NIH, Dr. Collins presents a roadmap on how to navigate our deeply divided and increasingly science-skeptical nation, using what he calls the 4 core sources of judgment and clear thinking: truth, science, faith, and trust. In their review of the book, Booklist wrote that Dr. Collins is a reliable, insightful, and agreeable guide to the road to wisdom. Everyone, let us all welcome Dr. Francis S. Collins.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here at Politics and Prose to talk to you about this book, and appreciate your turning out this evening to engage with me, and I'm looking forward to the questions that we will get to in a bit. There are some distinguished people here I just have to recognize. The former Secretary of Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala, who was once my boss. And the former CDC director, my friend Peggy, right here.
FDA.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yes. I knew that. FDA. You don't want to be blamed for CDC. Is that what you're saying? No, it's okay. Great. Great to see you there. And hello to some of my neighbors. Great to see you all here as well. I haven't done this in about 18 years. The last time I stood at this podium was 2006, when I had published a book called The Language of God, about how I saw science and faith as not in conflict with each other, but actually having a lot to say to each other that was complementary and harmonious. So yes, it's a little different now, being in this space of trying to bring forth to all of you something about a book that is called The Road to Wisdom. So what is wisdom anyway? Wisdom is not the same as knowledge, but it certainly depends on knowledge. You very much need to have the facts before you can be wise, but that's not quite sufficient. You also need an opportunity to attach to that understanding and judgment and insight and moral consequences of your decisions, the kind of judgment that requires that. I'll tell you a little joke about wisdom, and maybe it'll illustrate some of this. There was a young man who was interested in finding the source of wisdom, and he asked lots of people, how do I find out the source? And some people said, well, I know, and other people said they know, but nobody really seemed to know. And then he heard that there was this master guru somewhere on top of a mountain who had the answer. So he went to see what would the master say, and he climbed up there, and he said, Master, tell me, what really is the secret of wisdom? And the master said, well, actually, it's pretty simple. It is about good judgment. And the young man said, well, yeah, but how do you get good judgment? And the master said, oh, well, you have experience. And the young man said, well, how do you get experience? And the master said, bad judgment. Does it feel like we've kind of been going down that road lately, trying to get wisdom, but sometimes with a lot of bad judgment, hopefully in the process picking up some experience along the way? Think of Spock as the example of knowledge, and think of Yoda as the example of wisdom. So we need to have the Yoda version of this, I think, right now. So I'm on this road with you. It's a metaphor of a road we're all traveling. It's not like we've already gotten there or ever will, but we're on this journey, trying to acquire along the way wise insights into things around us. And sometimes it's pretty bumpy. And I don't know about you, sometimes I'm in the ditch because I've really mixed up the difference between truth and opinion. Or I've mixed up who to put trust in. Or I've mixed up, where does my faith fit into this? as well as what I know as a scientist, because both of those are my stories. My book begins with the story of a spectacular research failure. Mine. My first real effort to make a contribution to molecular biology. I was a postdoctoral fellow at Yale. I had already gotten a PhD in quantum mechanics, and now I was shifting into life science, and I was sure I was going to make my mark. And I was given this research project by a very thoughtful mentor who was also a communicator of the worst sort, so I most of the time didn't know what he was talking about. But I figured, okay, I'm going to take this project forward, and it is going to be amazing. I'm going to develop this new technology that everybody is going to want to use. And because I was new at this, I was dropping things, I was making mistakes, using the wrong buffer, everything you could think of. But eventually it all started to work. And it was like 6 months of this hard labor trying to get to the point where I could really show this technology was going to be successful. And then everybody was going to want to use it too. And I would be famous. And the day came after a 2-week experiment where the results were going to become clear, and I was ready for the perfect answer. And it was a complete and utter disaster. It was completely unremediable. The failure was because of a profound misunderstanding of something fundamental about molecular biology that I did not know about. So there I was, basically at that point, having blown 6 months, my first 6 months, as a life science investigator. And I was pretty sure this was it. I confess to you, I spent a fair amount of time that evening in the men's room, in the stall, crying because I didn't want to have the other researchers see me in this state of complete meltdown. And it was. And around me were all these extremely capable people who were always making great discoveries every day, and I was sure I was just not one of these. So the next day I went to my research advisor and I said, I think it's time for me to quit. And he said, oh, no, it's all right. These things happen. Let's find you another project. And then I went to my department chair. It was one of the persons that had recruited me there. And I said, I think I need to stop doing this because it's clearly not right for me. And he said, actually, let me tell you about my first experiment. And his was an utter failure as well. And he said, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I learned from that. And from that day on, I was much more of an effective researcher because I understood something about when you're designing an experiment, you can't just hope it's going to work. You've got to actually do all of the deep thinking about ways it might fail and prepare for that. Okay, I heard that. Then I went to my pastor, who happened to be a former NASA engineer. And I said, I think God is maybe giving me a message here that I should be doing something else. And he said, no, they're there. Let's look at some of these remarkable figures of the faith, all the way from Moses all the way through to Peter and Paul. Did they give up when they had a failure like this? No. Go and read Proverbs 24, verse 16. He said, okay, I'll go read that. Okay, here it is. For though the righteous fail 7 times, they rise again. But the wicked stumble when calamity strikes. Well, I didn't want to be wicked. I wanted to be righteous. So, okay, I figured out this is an opportunity to learn something. Every failure is a chance to grow. And what I learned from that is experimental design really matters. Don't put 6 months into a project without really thinking hard about whether there's a flaw in there somewhere. So that's a little example of this road to wisdom that the book is about how we learn things along the way, sometimes painfully, but also gainfully. But why this book and why now? Why now? I was inspired to write this book after spending many years in the public eye and developing growing concern about how our societal polarization has warped our thinking in 4 major ways. I'm going to tell you about these 4 in a little bit of detail. They get in the way of our making progress on that road to wisdom. That includes our ability to discern what is actually true, our understanding of science, our ability to apply effectively the fundamentals of faith, and our insights about where to place our trust. This is my humble attempt in this book to try to unwarp us and to seek to recover what matters most, which I fear is under threat right now. So let's consider those four fundamentals: truth, science, faith, and trust in order. First of all, truth. Does truth matter to you? We're in a postmodern environment. Some people would say there is no such thing as truth. That might be true for you, but it's not true for me. And that would be okay if they were talking about an opinion about who won the Emmys. But if it's about whether the earth is flat, I'm sorry, that is a fact, an established fact. There are thousands of people who belong to the Flat Earth Society. I kid you not. That's not a good thing, that it's okay to say, well, the idea that the earth is round might be true for you. It's not true for me. It doesn't work that way. Objective facts are facts. They don't care how you feel about them. That's an important issue. These days, it seems like there's a fact, I don't like it, therefore I don't believe it. You're not allowed to say that if it's an established fact that has been well sustained by lots of evidence. My two daughters, when they were growing up, there was one thing that made them most uncomfortable of all the things that happened, and that was to be caught in a circumstance where they didn't seem to have quite told the truth. And out would come that accusatory finger and that statement, "Did you lie to me?" And that was the moment where everything sort of stopped in time. And sometimes there were excuses and sometimes there were denials, but everybody remembered that, including the dad. Because I realized as I'm being hard on them, somebody should be hard on me sometimes too, because I wasn't entirely truthful in everything. But truth really matters. It's hard not to talk about this on Connecticut Avenue when Comet Pizza is right down the street. And there were a lot of people, and some still do, who thought there was a pedophile gang somewhere in the basement of Comet Pizza, and that led to Pizzagate, where that guy from North Carolina came and shot up the place. I mean, really, we are supposed to be the most advanced technological country in the world, and people actually believe this stuff. And some would say 15% of the country, even now, believes that our country is controlled by people who are pedophiliacs and have some plan to obtain blood from children that will allow people to not age the way they normally would. That's the sort of thing people believe. There is another conspiracy that says most of the world leaders that we look at are actually very large, shape-shifting reptilian hominids who look like people, but actually they're not. Queen Elizabeth was one of them. Did you know that? And their headquarters, in case you happen to go nearby, is in the basement of the Denver International Airport. People believe this stuff. We are in trouble if that's it. Well, people believe pets are being eaten by migrants in Springfield, Ohio. So we're in trouble in all kinds of ways that are much more current. So let's agree. I think if we don't agree, we're real in trouble. Let's agree there is such a thing as objective truth. Yeah, you got to be rigorous in your standards about how you agree. That has been established. But once it's there, and it has evidence behind it from various sources, maybe it's about history, maybe it's about science, society has kind of accumulated this in what Jonathan Rauch calls our constitution of knowledge, that this is a fundamental sense of things you can count on. Then let's not start tearing those down just because we don't like the answers. So truth. And then science as a second topic, obviously closely aligned to truth. What I learned from that first failure, that science can actually make mistakes, waste time, waste resources, sometimes get conclusions that turn out to be wrong. But mind you, science is self-correcting. That if anything really important is discovered by science, it's going to get checked and rechecked. And so if something has stood up over the course of multiple cycles of checking and rechecking, you can be pretty confident it's true. And you ought to be more reliably dependent on that than the latest post on Facebook from somebody who says it's not true. But again, we are in that place where sometimes that all gets mixed up. Running the Human Genome Project, as I was called to do, at a time where a lot of people were not in favor of this, and there was a lot of questions about whether it was going to be possible to read out 3 billion letters of the human DNA instruction book. There were a lot of people who said, just do it in a sort of slightly quick and sloppy way, and it'll be all right. It'll still add value. That didn't seem like the right answer. There was even a guy who was somewhat tongue-in-cheek saying, this is going to be so boring. reading out all these 3 billion letters? Let's assign it to prisoners. And let's say if you can read out 30,000 letters, you get parole. I don't think that would be a way to get good quality out of the results. So we had to get it right. Science is insistent on getting it right. And scientists are, by their very nature, skeptical about somebody else's claim to get it right. And they're going to go see if they agree. So science, while it makes mistakes, it's self-correcting. And as a source of truth about nature, it's about as good as it gets. And then there's faith. Some of you may say, what's faith doing in here? Why is that in a book about wisdom? Well, I will admit to you, and I already did, that I'm a person of faith. That when I think about wisdom, in fact, I have this pen in my pocket that my daughter gave me. Where does wisdom come from? Well, this says it comes from James 1:5, chapter 1, verse 5 of James, which is this: if any of you lack wisdom, ask of God, who gives to all generously and without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Okay, as a believer, I'm counting on that. But faith is a different kind of way of finding the truth than science, and we got to keep those things straight. Faith asks questions many times that begin with the question, why? Science is really good at the questions that start with how. But if you really want the whole truth and not some compartmentalized version, not something called scientism that ignores faith, or not something that denies science because it's seen to be a threat to faith, both of those are unfortunate, then you can actually have the chance to ask all the questions. And for me and many others who follow that same view, this is a wonderful way to spend your time. In that way, science then becomes an ability to understand God's creation in new ways. And the laboratory is not just a laboratory, it's kind of a cathedral. And science isn't just an adventure or a detective story, which it is. It's also kind of worship. Think about that. What did Solomon ask for, son of David, when here he was asked to take on being the king of all these people and he didn't quite know what to do? He asked for wisdom, a wise and discerning heart, and that's what God gave to him. There again, faith traditions recognizing, read the whole book of Proverbs, it's all about wisdom, that this is both knowledge, but it's a moral framework. And it certainly leads to this notion that we are here with love for our neighbors and even love for our enemies, as it says in the Sermon on the Mount. And then trust. Trust is plummeting in everyone and everything. If you've looked at what Gallup does every year, sort of asking people, what's your trust in various things? And look at what's happened over the course of the last 15 years. It has gone straight down. The only organizations where even 50% of people have trust are small businesses and the military. Everything else, way down, way down. Single digits for some of those, like the Congress. Some of that trust loss is earned based on the way in which institutions have not behaved in a way that necessarily has inspired us to be trustworthy, but some of it is just manufactured. It's because we have gotten into this mindset of questioning expertise about everything, and perhaps then willingness to accept opinions that are not based on expertise but happen to appeal to us. That means a deterioration of trust across the board. Think about your own experience when you have to make a decision about trusting in someone or some institution. What are the criteria you use? I had to think about that a bit myself. I recently had a diagnosis of cancer, prostate cancer. I was pretty public about that, and I am right now. And this was not an answer I was hoping to receive from the blood tests and the biopsies, but it was, okay, time to do something here. This is a cancer that's gotten very aggressive, that unless you do something surgically, this is going to spread to other parts of your body. Okay, I've got to figure out where am I going to put my trust to have something really significant done rather permanently to my body. So I figure I need to figure out who's got the expertise, and I'll make some phone calls and talk to a lot of people. There was one moment where both I and the person who answered the phone had to break out laughing when we realized what she had said. I called, and the person who answered the phone said, "Urology clinic, can you hold?" Would I be calling you if that was really not a problem? But eventually, kind of figuring out of the options that were there, I realized what are the criteria I was using. I wanted integrity. I wanted from the people who were doing this a sense of honesty. They were going to tell me straight what was actually things that they knew and what they didn't. I wanted them to have competence, to have done a lot of this and to know what they were doing and to be prepared to do a really good job. And I also wanted them to have humility, to recognize that they weren't God and that they had sometimes made mistakes and be willing to share that as well. But then there was one more. For me, I'm a researcher. I wanted them to care about the research aspects of this. I wanted them to take my experience and learn from it and figure out a way to teach other people about it, which is why I ended up at the National Institutes of Health in the clinical center. They are my docs. And they did all of those things, but they especially assured me, you're part of a clinical protocol. What we learn from you will help us with the next ones. And that was important. So you see those four criteria: integrity, competence, humility, and that last one, which is sort of aligned values. Are you aligned with me in terms of what you're trying to do? That, in my case, I would say all kind of fit. But there's a risky thing going on here in our current polarized situation because we are polarized. And so people find themselves off in these bubbles or echo chambers or tribal collections, whatever you want to call them. And part of the aligned values then is, I don't think I want to trust anybody who's not in my bubble. But maybe the information you really need is coming from another bubble and you're going to discount it because, well, that's not my kind of person. We're closing ourselves off to really valuable input because of the polarization, and we're likely to accept recommendations from within our bubble that may not actually be good for us, but we trust that person because, you know, that's somebody who thinks like I do about partisan politics, for instance. This has gotten us into a lot of trouble, and I think a lot of the deterioration of trust has been on that basis of having to have the aligned values part of this become the most prominent. And integrity and competence and humility are kind of downgraded a little bit. And it's all about, is this person part of my tribe? So there we are with those four problems. Now I wouldn't call them problems. They're areas of opportunity and strength for society. Truth, science, faith, and trust. And it feels like they're all kind of out of alignment. And the consequences for that feel not just unfortunate, but actually really serious. So where are we now? I have to talk to you now about my experience as the director of the National Institutes of Health for 12 years, under 3 presidents. An amazing privilege to be able to be in that position, trying to steer the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, right up the road here. But something really disheartened me about what happened with COVID. And particularly about this whole issue of who do you trust? Do you remember the first part of 2020? We've all kind of tried to suppress it. It was awful. It was clear there was a bad thing that was happening in China, and then it was coming to our shores, and now all of a sudden it's all over the place, and we're shutting everything down, and people are starting to die. By March, April, May of 2020, thousands of people are dying every day, and we have nothing really that we know will help them. We get remdesivir along about May, which helps a bit for the sickest people, but otherwise we really don't have a therapy that works. We need a vaccine. Well, the vaccine got started within days of the recognition that this was a serious pandemic. The Vaccine Research Center and the heroic figures working there right up here at NIH designed that mRNA vaccine in 48 hours that many of you took advantage of. I certainly did when it went through all the appropriate tests over the coming months. And it went into a phase 1 trial in just 60 days and into a phase 3 trial, which means 30,000 volunteers, God bless them, agreed to sign up for this and to basically roll up their sleeves and say, I want to be part of this trial, even though I don't know if I'm actually getting the vaccine or a dummy shot. And it was a 50-50 chance. We were all holding our breath. This was the year with no sleep. Tony Fauci and I would talk about what would be a good outcome here, recognizing most vaccines fail. So that would not be a good outcome. But even the ones that work, like the typical flu vaccine, may only give you 50, 60% efficacy. So I would say maybe 60% would be good enough, but I sure hope we can do better. And Tony would say, well, I think we ought to go for 70. But nobody knew, because you have to do the experiment. So after 3 or 4 months, after watching what happened to the people in the trial, did they get infected or did they not? If they got infected, did they get really sick? The time came, a late November evening, to unblind the data. That's how you do this. Nobody knows in this trial, including the people running the trial, exactly who got the shot that had the vaccine and who got the dummy until that moment. And then the data is revealed. It was astounding. 95% efficacy and almost no indication with 30,000 people of any serious side effects at that level. Later on, there were side effects, but they were much less common than you could have picked up in 30,000. I was supposed to speak that evening to the people who had worked so hard on this, and I couldn't. I was so choked up. All I could do was give thanks. It was an answered prayer, and shed a lot of tears, because this was science in its finest form. I think in historical terms, this is probably the most remarkable achievement of science to save humanity in all of history. And there it was, in just 11 months. No other vaccine had ever been produced in less than 5 years, and most of them weren't as efficacious as this was. So we all felt, okay, this is good. We're going to be all right. Let's just manufacture these things and get them out there as fast as we can. And that's what began to happen. But by the middle of 2021, when vaccines were freely available to everybody and free, it was pretty clear that a lot of the public had lost trust in this enterprise, that they weren't sure that those vaccines were safe, and they weren't sure they wanted them. And people of faith were concerned about whether these had fetal cells in them, and people had various other things they had heard about. This is going to change your DNA, or maybe it'll make you sterile. All these conspiracies that were flying around. And people like me, as part of the government effort to communicate about science, tried to tell it like it was, but I don't think we were as effective as we should have been. We often failed to sort of point out the things we weren't sure of. And so we came across as sounding as if we knew everything. And that came across as sort of elitist. And people didn't necessarily relate to that. And the consequence of what was 50 million people basically said, no, thank you. Now go back to July of 2021, and people are still dying. And most of the people who are dying are people without vaccination. The Kaiser Family Foundation has done the analysis and estimates that between June of 21 and April of 22, just about 10 months, 235,000 Americans died unnecessarily in graveyards because of misinformation, because of the problem with truth, science, faith, and trust. It wasn't just a terribly unfortunate societal problem, it killed people. I could not look at that. I still cannot look at that without feeling some need to understand it and some need to try to do something about it. So what happened? Truth was blurred. Some people weren't even convinced that COVID was a real disease. Science was doubted and often poorly explained, including by people like me. Faith perspectives, which should have been in the place of standing up for truth and love and reaching out to your neighbors and taking care of those in trouble, were often overtaken by political messages. And trust was withheld from some of the most reliable sources like the CDC and granted instead to people who had a mouthpiece that they were using on the internet. And many of them made a lot of money as a result. Wisdom was not achieved in this circumstance. During this time, I was speaking a lot to my spiritual mentor, the Reverend Tim Keller, who died a little over a year ago of pancreatic cancer, and who's the person that I learned the most from about how to be a person who really thinks about things in a spiritual perspective. In talking to Tim about this, he said, Francis, you have to do something about this. You have to write something. And I'm like, I don't think I'm the person to do this. He said, no, you just have to. So blame him if you have to look at this book you will see the book is dedicated to my friend Tim, who I miss every day. Now, I've talked about this with COVID vaccines, but I could make a lot of the same points, but I won't for time, about climate change. Look where we are right now. What is the truth of climate change? It is that our planet is warming at an unprecedented rate since about 1950. The thermometer is not a political instrument. The data is absolutely unequivocal. And that the other part of the science, which now 99% of scientists who study climate agree, is that this is because of human activity, and particularly the burning of fossil fuels. That is settled science. And yet, in our current circumstance where, again, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me if I don't like the conclusion, people are still arguing about whether this is real or not. And that's holding us back from actually doing a lot of the things we could be doing more effectively to address this. And this is not a hopeless situation. This is a situation that requires action, but the action is being delayed and slowed down by an unnecessary argument about whether we really know that something is happening. So truth has gotten kind of distorted here by established facts being pushed into the category of opinions. Science is being distrusted by people who don't necessarily like its conclusions. Many faith communities are actually among the most likely to sign up in denial stages about whether climate is happening, or to claim that, you know, God wouldn't have created a planet where we could do harm to anyway, so it'll be okay. And trust has gotten damaged. So again, climate change, just like public health and COVID, is suffering in a way that's hurting our future generations, and we should all feel deeply concerned about, because we're losing time on what could be a much more effective response. So I'm painting a picture here that probably sounds a little depressing. I don't want it to be, because I think there is a response here. I'm giving you the diagnosis. Now let's talk about the therapy. I believe that in this country and most other countries, the majority of people are not on board with the status quo of recriminations and grievances and animosities and polarization and having everything dominated by the fringes on the left and the right. Most of us are in what the group called More in Common has identified as the exhausted middle. We're a little blue, we're maybe a little red, we're believers, we're skeptics. We are not out there throwing verbal bombs at people on the other side. We actually want to try to do something to bring ourselves back around, but we're not quite sure what to do. This book is aimed for them, and if you're one of those people, I hope when you get to chapter 6, which is all about the actions, there will be things there that you will say, I could adopt some of those things and I could help. I won't have to say, our country shouldn't be like this. I can say, I don't need to be like this. I can do something myself. We don't need to give in to pessimism or cynicism. We've had enough of that, haven't we? So what to do? First of all, let's each of us try to get our own house in order. Are you carrying around in your storehouse of things that you call true, things that really aren't, that have somehow crept in there on the basis of some kind of source that wasn't actually authoritative or correct? Have a careful look at how we sift things that are coming at us now. How do we tell the difference between facts and fakes? A 5th grade teacher carried out an exercise with his students that we could maybe carry out with the whole country, challenging them by giving them examples of media stories that were either right, accurate, well evidence-based, and things that were made up, and asked them to figure out which was which. And they got really good at it. They figured out such things as, okay, what's the author's expertise? There you go, that would be important. What's the claim, and has it ever been validated by anybody else? Does it match with any previous observations, or is it like totally out of the blue? Be careful about those. And they ended up fact-checking him for the rest of the year, which he complained about afterwards. But we could do better at that. We have so much stuff coming at us, and our filters are often not as good as they could be in sorting out the facts from the fakes. So that's one thing. Get ourselves attached to truth. And make a commitment right now that you're not going to distribute information on social media or wherever if you're not sure it's true. Because these viral spreads of things that turn out to be harmful and weren't true at all, we're all part of that sometimes. And then secondly, We got to figure out how to bridge the gap between these tribal alliances that are driven by a lot of things, but particularly by politics. I'm part of an organization called Braver Angels. Braver Angels has brought together since 2016 people who are on very different sides of contentious issues like gun control or abortion or what should we be doing about public health or immigration. And in a very carefully constructed, moderated session, basically carrying out marriage counseling for America. Like, how do we get people to listen to each other instead of just talking at each other or sometimes shouting? Now, we need to do a lot more of that. I don't want to be cynical about this. One of the persons at Braver Angels said, "Oh, you mean you want me to walk in that other person's shoes before I criticize them?" And somebody said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I can do that, because by the time I've walked a mile in their shoes, they're a mile away. And I've got their shoes." That's not the right idea. That's not where we're going here. I have a partner in Braver Angels who runs a trucking company in Minnesota and who is furious about all the ways that the government mishandled the public health aspects of COVID-19, which did a lot of damage, as he perceives it, to his business, to his kids' schooling, and was not a good fit for his rural community in the middle of Minnesota, even though it seemed like it was being driven by what was happening in the big cities. The first time I met Wilk, I thought, boy, I'm not going to be able to be in this room very long. But you work at it and you listen. And I began to recognize I can sort of see where he's coming from with some of these reactions. And he could kind of see where I was coming from. And Wilk and I are now pretty good friends. He still thinks I'm wrong about stuff. I still think he's wrong about stuff. We did a session for Braver Angels in Gettysburg, symbolic choice of locations, in front of 700 people. And the title of the session was "An Elitist and a Deplorable Walk into a Bar." You can guess who was the elitist. Yeah, that was me. And we had a very frank conversation trying to model how it is that we could do more of this. If you know of organizations like this, and Braver Angels now has 100 chapters around the country, think about joining up with that, becoming part of this, getting that kind of experience of how to really listen to understand, not listen to plan your snappy response, but listen to understand. A lot can be done there. And it'll work for a community as well. And we certainly need our communities to come back together in churches and other places. I believe that's possible, but it's up to us, the exhausted middle. It ain't going to come from the politicians. They're kind of enjoying the polarization, it seems, or just performing into the microphones. It's not going to come from the media. It's got to come from us. That is our challenge. So finally, I would say, if that appeals to you, in that last chapter of the book is also an action you can take. Not just to nod your head and say, yeah, okay, maybe. Is a pledge. Think about that. You can look it up later on if you want. If you just punch into the internet, Road to Wisdom Pledge, it'll take you to the Braver Angels site. And there is a 4-paragraph, brief paragraph statement about what I think it would help a lot if we could all agree to. And it's pretty straightforward stuff. Like, I am going to pledge to try to really understand what is true and what is not, and not to distribute things that are not accurate. I'm going to try to reach out to people who have different opinions than me. I'm going to try to love my neighbor instead of demonizing people who don't agree with me. And all of that kind of, if we could put that all together as a national effort of this exhausted middle, I think we might absolutely be able to get somewhere. And I think there's a role for a pledge. You pledge when you get married. You pledge in the college to follow the honor roll, all of the things that we do. Why not, in this circumstance, make a commitment of that sort? Think about that. And you can actually, if you sign it, put your name up there. Right now, there's only about 150 people who are all Braver Angels members, because tonight is the first launch of this pledge for the rest of the world. So you can be among the first to add your names to that if you think it's something you want to do. Read it carefully. Decide whether it actually matches your determination to try to become part of the solution. So that's what I want to tell you about this evening. There's a lot of other stuff in this book, and I was trying not to just give you the Cliff Notes version of it. And I hope if you have a chance to buy one and look at it, you'll find some things in here that resonate with you. I am an optimist. I do believe our society, for all of the troubles that we're in, is a place of great love and capabilities and smarts and vision. We just have to figure out how to tap back into that. So with that, I will stop. Thank you, and take your questions. And you're right up there, sir. Yes.
So I think I speak on behalf of everybody here. Thank you for your brilliant career and all that you did for our country and for the world. So thank you. My question is really a request, I guess. Could you put on your futurist hat and tell us some things that you know about, I'm not a scientist, that's coming down the road that you're excited about, optimistic about in biomedicine or whatever?
I'd love to do that. There's a lot. I think this is the most amazing time in biomedical research that has happened in all of human history. Maybe there'll be an even more amazing time in the future, but right now, compared to where we've been, this is it. And for all the young folks who are interested in science, some of whom in my lab are over here, this is a great moment to be in this circumstance of making those discoveries. Particular things I could point to, I guess I would point to rare genetic diseases, which affect actually collectively 25 to 30 million people, where the whole magic of gene editing, the CRISPR-Cas revolution, is starting to work. We are curing sickle cell disease now. The first molecular disease, all those people who've suffered all those decades now have not just something that helps a little bit, it looks like a cure. And that's one of 7,000 genetic diseases that could potentially be approached in the same way. How could you not get excited about that? My lab works on a rare example of that called progeria, a disease of premature aging, and we're determined to see what we can do to actually not just help those kids, but maybe even cure that mistake in their DNA that has caused this particular illness. Cancer. I am bold enough to say that I think we could begin to forecast a place where we can prevent cancer much more effectively with cancer vaccines. That mRNA strategy that worked miraculously for COVID means that we can make vaccines at a turnaround time much faster than we used to and try a lot of new ideas to see if they're going to work. And then if you get cancer anyway, and I'm one of those where that happened, I think our ability, even with stage 4, using things like cancer immunotherapy, is getting better and better and better to slow down or stop or even cure those advanced cases. That is happening in a wonderful way. Neuroscience. We have this brain initiative at NIH that I had the privilege of starting when I was the director, and it's now 10 years along, involving hundreds and hundreds of neuroscientists and engineers and robotics experts and computational experts, and we are figuring out how those 86 billion neurons between your ears do what they do. The most complicated structure in the known universe is beginning to yield up some of its secrets. It's going to take a while to figure out how to turn that into the advances we're hoping for in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia and depression and autism, all down that list of conditions where the brain isn't quite doing what you want it to, but we're on that path. It'd be a great time to start into neuroscience right now. And whether it's that or infectious disease or diabetes, another disease my lab works on, anywhere you look, there's amazing, exciting things happening. This is the time for those breakthroughs to happen. Now, I got to say, the only thing that's holding us back is resources. If you're a young investigator trying to do research funded by NIH, your chance of getting your grant funded is less than 1 out of 5. And we're leaving a lot of great science on the table and also slowing down the economic benefits that come from this. So I do hope that as we figure out how to deal with our government's finances, which are always complicated, we can see this as one of the best things the government does, both in terms of saving lives and actually encouraging the economy and saving money. It does both. But it's a difficult time sometimes these days to make that particular case. So you asked for a speech and you got one. Other questions? Yes.
I'll say it in the mic. Thank you for your talk and talking about specifically bridging that gap, because it's really been on my heart. I'm curious what your thoughts are about engaging people that don't share that view, or the people that would walk the mile away, that just totally dismiss people that don't think like they do and would just as soon see the country split in two. How do you engage your fellow elitists on that?
Yeah. Those are good, honorable people. They've gotten burned, potentially, by trying to have conversations and ending up getting something very unfriendly in their face. In a certain way, we've all had some of those experiences. So I think that's almost a universal sense, but some will be a little quicker to feel like it's worth trying in that kind of interaction. So I think it's up to us who are willing to try that to kind of identify, start there. Identify somebody who you know disagrees with you on something and seems to be really not interested in having that conversation. And then reach out to them and say, you know you feel really strongly about this, and I'd like to understand that. I don't want to talk you out of your opinion, but I want to understand that because I feel like I'm only surrounded by people who agree with me. Can we have coffee? And then you can walk me through, and I want you to tell me, how did you come to that particular perspective? What about your background led you to that point? And you'll learn a lot of stuff. And oftentimes, not always, maybe not the first time, they'll say, and how did you come to your view? And with a little bit of encouragement, something starts to happen. But you got to invest in it. It's not a 5-minute conversation in a cocktail party. It's something where you really have to show that person you care enough about them to listen to a perspective that they know you don't agree with. And they will find that, I think, to be a kind of a gift, because it's not happening very much right now. We all want to be understood. We all want a chance to explain ourselves. Right now, not so much opportunity to do that. So yeah, give it every try. I totally hear you. This is hard. It's really hard. Braver Angels, organizations like that can help you by giving you some of the training, some of the environment to make it a little easier. Other questions? The microphone's right there. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Collins. I'm a medical student and a graduate student in my 4th year of my PhD studying cancer vaccines. I'm excited as you are about the potential for these next generation therapies. I'm also a kid from rural Wisconsin where vaccine hesitancy is quite rampant. I suppose my question is that it can be discouraging for the people of my generation to see throughout our lifetime the hesitancy of the public and the distrust that you're talking about occur for the science that we're studying. What can the scientists of my generation do to ensure that not only that the therapies that we're discovering are made for the public, but also the public will be receptive to taking those therapies?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you for asking it. I think the time for scientists to say communication about their work is somebody else's problem is over. That all of us who are involved in science need to accept some opportunity and responsibility to come up with ways to explain the value of what we're doing in a fashion that's not full of jargon and 50-cent words, but actually explains why it would matter to an average grandmother. That's often the way many of us think about it. How do you actually put this across in a way that is not talking down to people and not talking over their head? I do think one of the things that we didn't have with COVID was a sort of national network of scientific expertise to be part of the communication process. It was all pretty top down. One of the things that some of us are talking about, do we need a science communication corps where you invite everybody like you, everybody who is in science, whether they're undergraduates studying biology or chemistry, whether they're PhD students or MDs, or whether they're practicing docs, or whether they're high school teachers teaching science, or members of the scientific society. Could we put that whole community together in a coherent way and develop a science communication strategy that actually reaches out to every community, instead of having it seem, as it did during COVID, like it's all coming from somewhere on high? Maybe it's CDC, maybe it's NIH, maybe it's the White House. It would have been a lot easier, I think, to generate people's trust and enthusiasm if the person giving them the information was somebody who was like them, lived in their community. So all we need is a philanthropist to donate about $1 billion. And I think we could do this science communication corps. I don't think the government can do it because it'll immediately be suspect.
Right.
But it is something a lot of people, and from your question, I assume you're one of them, are kind of interested in doing this. But it would like to have some, well-vetted materials so that you're not just making stuff up and hoping it sticks. I think that's a big challenge for the future. There's something in the book here about maybe we could do that, but we're going to have to get really organized, and we're not right now.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi.
Good evening to you, and thank you so much for your leadership at NIH and the Human Genome Project and all the work you did. I also just want to note, as a fellow Christian, that I really appreciate how you have made it more okay to intertwine faith and science, and so I'm really grateful for that. And thank you for sharing those stories. I'm actually a master's student in counseling at Bowie State University in Bowie, Maryland. And I was just wondering if you had any other stories that you could share about any work that you recall from your time as director of NIH as it related to mental health. I know you talked a little about neuroscience, but anything else related to mental health? And then, just anything else related to race, and in particular, how you use the NIH to support African Americans in their health.
Yeah, those are two really important questions and big issues. With regard to health disparities, which we know are a really major problem in this country, NIH is deeply interested in trying to figure out what could be done about that. Not just study the problem, not just, as some cynics would say, admiring the problem, but actually coming up with programs to try to intervene. The National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, NIMHD, has really transformed their research program into those pilot interventions to try to see what could be done, because there's a lot that needs to be done there. In terms of mental health, it is such a hard problem, and it's getting worse, it seems, under all the stresses that our country is under. I'm particularly worried about young people and the way in which anxiety, depression, and suicide have been going up pretty dramatically in the course of the last 10 years. Jonathan Haidt's book, which many of you may have read, called The Anxious Generation, points to one of the reasons for that maybe is social media, and particularly the way in which social media causes young people to feel like they're just not making it and everybody else is much more beautiful and having much more fun than they are. And there's a lot of truth, I think, in his arguments there. I think social media has turned out to be actually a really serious risk, and I'm glad the Surgeon General has decided to at least suggest the idea of a warning label for kids under 13. But what are we going to do in terms of the research side of that? There's a lot of complexities because it's about not just the basic biology of the brain, but also about the environment. The biggest thing I saw that happened when I was there in terms of mental health advances was the development, although it doesn't work for everybody, of this ketamine approach for people who have had unresponsive, severe clinical depression, and who, at least some parts of those folks, have this dramatic, almost magical response in 20 minutes to an infusion of ketamine. People who have had depression for 20, 30 years without any break, and it's gone. And it stays gone sometimes for a while. And Carlos Zarate at NIH, who did a lot of that work, has shown me patients that just took my breath away. Obviously, not a panacea. We know people have died from ketamine overdoses recently, but it was an insight into something about depression that we ought to be able to build on. But there's so much more that needs to be done there. The National Institute of Mental Health at NIH is probably the one with, in many ways, the most difficult and important challenges ahead of them. Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, I didn't know you were that tall, so. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any advice about education for the general public so that they're more able to discern, and the conversations that you talk about where it's top down, that there's actually more of a two-way conversation because they have enough ability to understand that they can actually participate.
Yeah, it's another great question. I'm not an expert in what we need to do with our education system, but I think we would all agree that it hasn't done a particularly good job in teaching people critical thinking about how to assess a claim as whether it's truthful or not. Most of our education, sadly, seems to be about teaching people minutiae that you're going to be able to answer when you have to fill out the form to take the test. And the idea that critical thinking might be a lot more important than that, as well as character development, doesn't seem to be a main part of the curriculum. I have seen some examples, but oftentimes they're individual teachers who just say, this is what I want to do with my students, and have turned that into part of their curriculum. I talked about the 5th grade teacher who was teaching his kids how to tell the difference between a fact and a fake. Can you imagine if we did that everywhere? we'd have people who were prepared in this circumstance to be able to sift through those claims. And oftentimes right now we don't. So it's another call for action for an educational system, and there are a lot of calls for action. I'm not the person to figure out how to turn that into something that could actually be implemented, but we sure need to do something, because a lot of kids, I don't think, really get that part of their education. I was homeschooled until the 6th grade, and believe me, I had to learn critical thinking, or I was not going to get through the 1st or 2nd grade with my mom as the teacher, because that was a lot of what it was about, is how do you take a fact or what somebody said was a fact and decide if it's true or not. You better do some work on that. But I'm afraid a lot of kids don't get that same wonderful teaching that my mom gave me. Yes? Yes, please come to the microphone so people can hear. And I think we're getting close to the timetable, so maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more questions. Yes?
Hello, my name's Ellen, and I wanted to move back to mental health and our internal well-being to offer a bit of hope. Good. I am involved with something that was launched this week called Meditate America, and the whole idea is that we learn to spend 20 minutes a day, twice a day, with our internal world, not our external world. And it's being launched at 150 different cities, and it's involved with first responders, under-resourced schools, and also nurses. So if you want to know more, you can check out tm.org.
You heard it here.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for telling us about that. Dr. Alter.
Thank you, Francis. A wonderful talk. You know, of your 4 points, the one that resonates most with me is truth. Because it seems to me that's the foundation of everything in society. Faith is important. Everything else is important also. But if we start out to wisdom, you do it by knowledge, by learning the truth, what's real, what isn't real. If disinformation is now as powerful as information, we're in a lot of trouble. And that is what is dividing us, one of the big things dividing us. And how do you get 30 million people to discern the truth, the obvious truth?
We got work to do, don't we?
Yeah.
The message you just heard is from Nobel laureate Harvey Alter, right here. Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Harvey, who figured out the cause of hepatitis C and saved countless lives as a result. And how would you have done your work as a scientist, physician, trying to figure out a terrible disease if there wasn't a difference between what was true and what was just made up? It would have been chaos and useless, and nothing would have happened.
Well, it involves everything.
It does. The stakes are high, everybody. But I think the solution is all of us. And if this evening in some way has helped you figure out that that might be something you want to get engaged with, then I'll be very happy indeed. So thank you, everybody. I'll be glad to take a seat here if you have books you want to sign.